Pamela O'Neill is head of the Australian School of Celtic Learning, and she is the Sir Warwick Fairfax Lecturer in Celtic Studies at the University of Sydney. She's involved in several research projects, such as the edition and translation of early Irish ancient texts.
She received her PhD from the Centre for Celtic Studies at the University of Sydney in 2000. Her research interest is the relationship between landscape, material culture, archaeology, law, and history in early medieval Scotland and Ireland, as well as Celtic languages and cultures in Australia.
She has published several books, such as A Sense of Place, Monadic Scenes in Irish Australian Funerary Monuments, published in 2007, and Celts and Their Cultures at Home and Abroad, a festschrift for Malcolm Boone, published in 2013.
Today she talks about the Gaelic Scots in the Pacific, more specifically language and identity, so she develops how did the conditions in the Scottish Islands influence the lives of Gaelic Scots in the Pacific and their cultural identity and the survival of the Gaelic language.
To start by thanking Naomi and her colleagues, who've all been an absolute joy to be present with, and of course her wonderful students for putting on this conference, which I think is a really important one, for bringing me here and also for taking incredible good care of me. And Anna Laura has been putting up with me in her car for a day and a half now. So I'd like to acknowledge that the research I'm presenting today was carried out on unceded Ngunnawal, Bundjalung, Wonnarua, Warrami, Ngunnawal, Kamilaroi and Gadigal country. So spread across quite a bit of the country in Australia. And I think it's very important to recognise this, because many of the people of whom I will speak today, who had largely been displaced themselves, often under horrific circumstances, from the land to which they felt incomprehensibly strong connections in order to make way for sheep, and then they went on to be complicit in the same treatment of the Indigenous people of the lands to which they came. And that is something for us to reckon with as their descendants. Well, as you may have gathered from my introduction, while I am a Celticist, I am neither a linguist nor a modern historian. So what am I doing here? I usually work in the early medieval period, but I have been drawn to this topic because I feel that there's an important story to be told here. And it is a story which will soon be lost if nothing is done to preserve and retrieve this information before yet another generation of the people concerned passes on. So I've taken on the task for a few reasons. I have a knowledge of the Gaelic language, I have skills as a historian, and I have some understanding of the centuries of Gaelic culture which lie behind this story. I also, for what it's worth, live in Glen Innes, the so-called Celtic capital of Australia. I'd like to do something a little bit unusual. I want to dedicate this work, because it's work that is unfamiliar to me and outside of my comfort zone. I want to dedicate it to my late Gaelic teacher, Angus Mackenzie, who was a native Gaelic-speaking exile in 20th century Australia. And also, and this will come to no surprise, I've noticed there's a couple of my students online, I'd also like to dedicate it to my favourite Gaelic rock band, Runrig, who understood and represented certain aspects of this story better than anyone else ever will, in my opinion. So just a few kind of background observations. Firstly, chronologically, I'm confining myself today to the 19th century. There is interesting information, I think, to be gleaned from looking at both the 18th and the 20th centuries. I will maybe one day move on to that. Scholarship on the 19th century Scottish diaspora in the Pacific, notably in Australia and New Zealand, is moderately common. For Australia, for instance, we have Malcolm Prentice's The Scots in Australia. It's an obvious starting point, and I will talk about it. For New Zealand, for example, we've got Jock Phillips and Terry Hearn's book, Settler, New Zealand Immigrants from England, Ireland and Scotland. For other parts of the Pacific, though, such as Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, we've got next to nothing. And I was delighted to hear, while I was being given a lift home last night, that there is a new book about a Scottish family in New Caledonia, and I'm looking forward very much to getting a look at that and seeing if it can give me any inklings about Gaelic, whether it was here or not. And I will say that saying that we have next to nothing about these things merely means that the research has not been done yet. Hopefully it will be one day. Now, while books about and articles about the Scots in this part of the world are not uncommon, what is uncommon is particularising the Gaelic subset of the Scottish immigrants in the Pacific, amongst whom there were a good proportion of monoglot Gaelic speakers, that is, people who did not speak any other language. And indeed, sometimes Gaelic speakers are dismissed in language whose use is scarcely believable in the 21st century. And here is an example. Malcolm Prentice, in his book The Scots in Australia, which was published, no, that is not a typographical error, it was published in 2008, not 1908, said most of the Highland immigrants of the 1830s and 1840s came from the Western Highlands and Islands, the most backward part of Scotland. This explains why most of them spoke Gaelic and higher proportions were illiterate and Roman Catholic or Free Kirk. Clearly, for Malcolm Prentice, speaking Gaelic and worshipping outside the Anglican Church are backward. I personally don't agree, as you may have gathered. We can scarcely, in my opinion, expect objective, thoughtful analysis of their presence, culture and language from Malcolm Prentice. In fairness, though, Prentice does give us a little information about Gaelic in 19th century Australia, most of it somewhat superficial. Settlers gives us little space and arguably even less understanding to Gaelic in New Zealand. So apart from mentioning but not discussing the Hokanui Hills and a short unreferenced comment on Highland shepherds continuing to speak Gaelic for a time, there is little to be gleaned from that book. As to the rest of the Pacific, given that I've been able to find virtually nothing on Scottish migrants, it's no surprise that I have nothing on Gaelic. There is more work to be done. So, sorry, I've got too many things to press, going in the wrong direction. There we are. The question to begin with then is, how do we particularise what I call Gaelic Scots amongst the Scottish immigrants to the Pacific? To begin with, they originated in the Gaelic-speaking regions of Scotland. Now, the area highlighted on the map is actually the modern Highland local government area, and you can see that it's vast. But what we are talking about is essentially, if you slice that in half vertically, it's the bit to the left. And also these islands out on the left here that are outside the outline, we will also be including. So those are the regions which historically speak Gaelic and from which the immigrants I want to talk about today are drawn. This area is known as the Gaeltacht. We could call, Gaeltacht in Scottish Gaelic. We could refer to it as the Western Highlands and the islands off the west coast of Scotland. I like to be quite careful not to talk about the Scottish Islands because we do not include the Orkneys and Shetlands here. Gaelic was not ever regularly spoken in those places. Okay, so a lot of the people who came to the Pacific from those areas came via other places, notably the cities of the Scottish Lowlands, Glasgow, Edinburgh, the north of England, the cities there, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle and so on, and sometimes other places as well. Immigrants who originated in the Gaeltacht inevitably, and I suspect that the exceptions throughout the 19th century could probably be counted on your fingers, spoke Gaelic. And I will be looking at some evidence that some of them spoke only Gaelic on their arrival here on this side of the world. And one of my objectives with this research is to estimate what proportion of the Gaelic immigrants were monoglot Gaelic speakers. Now, having dispensed with the preliminaries, let's look at my first key question, and that is, how may the conditions in the Scottish Highlands and Islands which led to emigration have affected the lives of 19th century Gaelic Scots as immigrants in the Pacific? So I'm now going to give some sweeping generalisations. So historians of the Highland clearances, please cover your ears. I want to paint a general background so that I can give some subsequent detail. Now, much of Gaelic Scotland suffered variously in the aftermath of what would be the final defeat of the Jacobite cause at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. In the second half of the 18th century, punitive actions by the overwhelmingly non-Gaelic military and administrative bodies hastened the demise of the traditional Gaelic clan system. I say hastened, not caused. It's a very complicated situation. They also punished the wearing of Highland dress and the playing of traditional instruments, unless in the service of the Crown, quite importantly, and disincentivised the speaking of Gaelic, amongst other things. And this all set the scene for the rise of financially motivated removal of tenants from their lands, to be replaced by more lucrative forms of farming and less troublesome forms of farming, such as large-scale sheep breeding. This as a push factor, combined with some pull factors, to see more tenants relocated to the poorer coastal settlements, where they worked for such industries as the newly lucrative kelp and lime, until those industries also failed later in the 19th century. So this whole, what I can only describe as a mess, became known as the Highland clearances. And huge numbers of people were cleared from their land, many of them finding their way to North America and, of course, to the Pacific. And as if that wasn't enough, this was all exacerbated by famine episodes in the Highlands and Islands in the 1830s and 1840s. Now, the term Highland clearances can seem quite neutral and impersonal, but that is an impression which is speedily reversed if we look at, for instance, a set of peat banks, probably worked by the same families for centuries, but abandoned essentially overnight, a bit over 150 years ago. The lines still clear and sharp in the landscape, not in this photo. Or, in this photo, walking over a wide bare plain to the upstanding ruin of a very large church, only to realise that its worshippers lived in the many dwellings whose foundations are under your feet and under the feet of the sheep around you. There are many individual Highland and Island communities with their own stories of despair, cruelty, starvation and more. I'm going to focus here on a few communities whose exile stories I have followed into the Pacific. And before I go on, I want to acknowledge support and assistance from quite a few people, but notably amongst them my student Kay Anderson, who I notice is online. Hi, Kay. This photo was taken in her presence. It was in fact she who spotted the church, and she's also given me several other leads in Australia, so I'm very grateful. Now, the first community I want to look at is the community of Solace on the Isle of North Uist. There is where it's located. And this is what it looks like today. Back in the day, it would have had many, many more houses. So Solace was a crofting community filled with the typical mixed small farms of the Hebrides. And the families who lived there had lived on the land for centuries and forged a very, very strong attachment to that land and to their community. And most of the community would have been related by common ancestry. Their shared language was Scottish Gaelic, and most, if not all, were monolingual Gaelic speakers. Solace was owned by Lord MacDonald of Slate on the Isle of Skye, an unpopular and inept landlord. He found himself deeply in debt, possibly as a result of gambling, we're not sure. In 1849, he decided to evict about 600 or 700 people from his Solace lands. So I think you'd agree that the houses we see there would not house 600 or 700 people, even under difficult conditions. Despite vigorous resistance from his tenants, by 1850, 1 year later, the region was entirely uninhabited and the dwellings all demolished. A great number of the displaced residents ended up sailing for South Australia, and we'll pick their story up later. The community of Kilmuir on the Trottenish Peninsula on the Isle of Skye was first inhabited in the Mesolithic period, so there have been people there for a long time. And again, this is what it looks like today, very different from how it would have looked 150 years ago. In the 19th century, Kilmuir was a crofting community much like Solace. Among the crofters were one Donald MacLodge. He was a literate ploughman. He lived with his wife Auna, his sons Toromid, Angus, Donal, Ian, Alistair and William, and his daughters Myrid and Carristiana. They were almost certainly monoglot Gaelic speakers despite their literacy. These lands were also owned by Lord MacDonald of Slate. And Kilmuir would not be finally cleared until MacDonald sold these lands in the 1850s. However, the MacLeod family emigrated to Australia in 1837 when the Gaeltacht was in the grip of a famine. They came on the Midlothian, and that ship sailed under John Dunmore Lang's assisted migration scheme. Emigration may have been the only viable option for our family. Little Carishtiana was 6 years old, and we're going to catch up with her presently, together with some of the other Midlothian passengers when they arrive in Australia. The so-called Slate Islands, close to Oban, marked there on the map with the red pin, were mined for slate from at least the 12th century. The Netherlands Slate Company was an enterprise of Lord Breadalbane, who owned the islands. In the Great Storm of 1850, the islands suffered catastrophic flooding due to unusual storm activity. Particularly hard hit was the island of Easdale, pictured here, and several of its mines became unworkable. The mining company, of course, was uninterested in assisting its Gaelic-speaking workers. With no way to earn a living, several quarrymen had no alternative but to leave the islands. Amongst them was Charloch MacAngus, who 10 years earlier had lived with his widowed mother and younger siblings, some of whom were also quarry workers from their early teens. Charloch travelled to Australia in 1851, and we'll see his final destination too. Now, while most people in this period were strongly attached to their land, there were some occupations that tended to involve a level of itinerancy. One of these was school teaching. Of course, teaching could have been, and sometimes was, done in one place, but all of the conditions I've just discussed tended to necessitate mobility on the part of teachers. Donald McIngan here was one such. This is Donald, obviously, towards the end of his life. He was a native of the Isle of Col, and he clearly remained very attached to his island. Nonetheless, he and his wife Isabel moved from place to place rather a lot. Their son Ian was born in Neudat in 1840. Donald was born on Eck in 1842, and Alistair was born back on Col in 1850. I'm not sure where Lachlan, Donacha, Anna, Mari, Kate, Moore, and the baby of the family, Echen, were born. I may yet find out. With a schoolmaster father, all of the children were well educated and apparently easily bilingual in Gaelic and English. The life of a Highland schoolmaster was evidently not an easy one, however, and we have plenty of documentation of that fact. When little Echen was just 2 years old, the entire family emigrated to Australia in 1860, having weathered the famines of the preceding decades. At this time, the patriarch, Donald Sr., was 50 years old. We'll see how they fared in Australia too. Now, having looked at the circumstances under which our Gaels entered exile, I now want to look at the signs of their presence here in the Pacific. And inevitably, the trail leads us most easily to individuals and families who were maybe just a little higher up the social ladder or somewhat less impoverished than the majority. And that is a sad reality that we have to face as historians, that we often don't see the people we're most interested in. They become invisible. So my question here is, how did Gaelic cultural identity shape their public lives in the Pacific? And I distinguish between public and private lives. So amongst the more educated and, I guess, less destitute Gaels, there was a strong tendency to form groups and societies. Sydney saw a Highland society formed where speeches and debates in Gaelic regularly took place, and that society survived into the 20th century. Caledonian societies were very common in towns and villages throughout Australia. In the small township of Coracai, northern New South Wales, marked on the map, our friend Schoolmaster McKinnon and his sons founded a Caledonian society, also officiated at Highland Games in Coracai. Gaelic was a feature at least once, according to contemporary reports. And here we have it. the Richmond River Caledonian Society was active in Coraki in the 1890s. One social function in August 1894, so right near the end of the 19th century, included a 30-minute address in Gaelic from the chairman. Just be thankful I'm not speaking Gaelic. I don't think I could do it for 30 minutes. So these survivals and these public manifestations of Gaelic do exist, but they are reasonably few and far between. The family, the McKinnon family, as they became known in Australia, were also very active in local politics and church politics. So when when the New South Wales government started to have representatives from this region, they were very active in campaigning and also very active in details surrounding the various Presbyterian churches in New South Wales, which we don't have time to talk about right now, interesting as they are. So a very high level of involvement from these Gaelic gentlemen who were very highly respected in their community. And so they split their time between Gaelic-focused activity and activity for the good of the wider community, which includes obviously a lot of non-Gaelic speakers. And quite interestingly, at one election, they back the Irish candidate because the Scottish candidate is from the wrong side of the church. Some things never change. The church is another thing that our people are quite active in. So Karishgina Niklioj, when she reaches Australia, she's only 6 when they leave Scotland, but she grows to maturity in Australia and marries Archibald Cameron, who is the first minister in the Presbyterian Church in the north of New South Wales. The church is founded there at Glen Innes, where I live. And this is the Cameron Memorial Church. To this day, it is known for the Camerons. So, again, we have a very prominent role being played by our Gaelic folk in public life, in this case, in the life of the Presbyterian Church, which is the life of the town in many ways early on. This church is founded in Glen Innes after the couple, as pioneers essentially, built their own wooden church about 10 kilometres outside Glen Innes at a place called Wellingrove, which was going to be the big town of the area, and then they changed their minds and built the big town at Glen Innes, and so the wooden church at Wellingrove was replaced by a church in Glen Innes. And all of this very ably managed by Archibald and Christina. Now, Archibald Cameron was probably a Gaelic speaker, but not a monoglot. And Christina clearly learnt English not too long after reaching Australia. And I guess as part of her growing, we all know that children before the age of 10 soak up languages very easily, unlike people of my age. Okay. Also in the church, I want to take you to Paterson, which is a very small place near Maitland, also in New South Wales. Now, Paterson is where Christina McLeod's shipmates, the John Dunmore Lang assisted migrants, many of them ended up in Paterson. They in fact wielded a little bit of power when they arrived. They refused to be separated. And so Lang, who had a brother who also held property up in this part of the world, arranged for them all to come to Paterson together. And so that Gaelic community builds this church, St Anne's Church in Paterson. St Anne is not a name of a church that we find very often in a Scottish or Presbyterian context, but here it is. And it becomes quite a staple of the community now. Paterson is a very, very small village. I would guess its population is less than 500, and yet it has 3 very strong churches of various denominations. St Anne's here is not currently in use, sadly. But very interestingly, in 1848, St Anne's Presbyterian Church presbytery or a session advertises in the Maitland Mercury for a teacher for their school. At this stage, schools haven't been nationalised in Australia, so they're still being run on an ad hoc basis by individual groups and churches. So the advertisement reads, "A teacher for the Presbyterian school in connection with St Anne's Scots Church, Paterson." There's a little bit of detail about how to apply. And then it says, a person able to present would receive an allowance from the church funds for officiating on Sabbath days. Now, I have not seen any scholarly comment on that sentence, but that is a very important sentence. Presenting is a very particular mode of worship practiced only in Gaelic-speaking communities. The Psalms have been translated into metrical Gaelic, and the mode of worship is that the precentor sings a line of the psalm, and then the congregation, as they are moved by the Spirit, sings it back in whatever tune that takes their fancy. It's quite an eerie experience. I actually participated in a presented church service on the Isle of Lewis in the middle of this year. It's quite amazing. So this ability to present means that the only applicant who could fill that requirement would be a Gaelic speaker, a native Gaelic speaker, and furthermore one who has practiced presenting in his past, and I say his advisedly. So the fact that the church is willing to subsidise in order to be able to have worship in the traditional Gaelic manner and language is really important here. And that message is further reinforced by the following really interesting sentence: preference will be given to one who can speak and teach the Gaelic language grammatically. So speaking we could understand as these are Gaelic speakers whose children speak Gaelic and they would like their children to be able to communicate with their teacher. That would be lovely. But indeed what they're asking for here is that their children be taught Gaelic. So there is a conscious will to have Gaelic transmitted to the next generation. Sadly, a very similar ad appears in 1849 and again in 1850. So I suspect they were unsuccessful. Another interesting aspect of this is the name of the minister, Christopher Iper. He's clearly not Scottish, much less Gaelic, and he is the first minister of Paterson who is not Scottish himself and probably the first who can't speak Gaelic. And so this need for a presenter becomes more pressing, but sadly doesn't seem to have ever been met. So the upshot of all that is that there are very few quite promising signs that there were some communities who wanted to preserve their Gaelic and who made Gaelic a part of their public presence. But these people are very, very much in the minority. When I spoke about all of the people that I was following leaving Scotland, I used their Gaelic names. These were the names they were given at birth. These were the names by which they were known in Scotland. In fact, they would have been known by those Christian names with nicknames after. Surnames weren't used because everyone in North Uist is called MacDonald, so it's not much point putting MacDonald in their name. Not quite everybody, but so these are the names that would have been natural to them. When they arrive in Australia, seemingly without exception, in public, they stop using those names. They anglicise those names. So Ian becomes John, Donald becomes Donald, Donacha becomes Duncan, and so on and so on. Quite an insidious erosion of identity, I think, and very interesting. But this seems to be part of the public persona that they feel it's necessary to project. So if that's the extent of the traces of public Gaelic, can we find out anything more about private Gaelic? What are these people doing with their Gaelic amongst themselves? So I want to now go back and follow some of the personal lives that we saw at the Scottish end. And when we do this, we get to some pretty sad stories, actually, and I start with the saddest one. And in this case, the work's already been done. I didn't have to do much here. Eric Richards in the 70s published a paper on this. And this is the people from Solace on North Uist, the 600 or 700 who vanished from their village and left it uninhabited within the space of less than a year. Now, these people came to Australia and arrived in Adelaide. And very, very sad situation. Not all of them arrived in Adelaide. So the ship first called at Queenstown in Ireland, where Several diseased passengers were put off and some died. So they had caught fevers in the ship. Suggestion is that the infection was there in the ship when they got on it. Who knows? Then the ship arrives in Melbourne en route, having lost several more lives. Some more diseased and dead people are put off in Melbourne. Then it arrives in Adelaide. They come ashore. Another big pile of them get sick. Some of them die. And they've been brought, part of the scheme that brings them is a promise that they'll be able to stay together when they get here. And that promise is not honoured. So not only are communities split, but families are split. So we have, on the whole, families can stay together unless there are unwell or infirm members of the family, in which case they are separated, basically. And what we end up with is quite a large number of individual nuclear family units, which is not a standard family unit in Scotland. That's what we did to them here. But we have lots of individual family units ending up in places like this. So this is in South Australia, Gulchan Bay, and the job that these people ended up doing, despite having been brought out to do farm work, is that they end up camping in dry creek beds in tents, breaking up rocks to make roads. And man, woman and child, this is the work they do because this is the only way they can be paid and eat. So they're in a harsh environment like this, having come from Scotland. Many of them die. My gloss is they die of broken hearts. They die of all sorts of diseases and accidents. On the ship, there were a number of suicides. The suicides continue when they arrive in Australia. It's a really, really devastating story. And, of course, they've only come because what they left was so bad they couldn't stay. They were forced away. They had nowhere that they could live in Scotland. So that's the very least cheery of the stories. Let's see if we can become a little more upbeat. Let's look at our friends, the McKinnons. Certainly must have been an indomitable bunch of people. So this is their transcript of their record, their shipping record. So on arrival, Lachlan, right down there on the bottom right, travels separately because he's an adult. But otherwise we have Donald, the father at the age of 50, his wife Ishbel, who is only 40, and then the non-adult offspring, Auna, Ian, Donald, Donacha, Mari, Kate, Alistair, Moore and Erchen. So they arrive in the Shoalhaven and they stay there for 9 years. The Shoalhaven is in the south of New South Wales coastal district. They're moderately successful down there. They eke out a living. They do various bits of work. But the time comes when the lands in the north of New South Wales are opened up for selecting. And they select a swathe of land near Coracai. We've already mentioned Coracai. And this is their first residence. And you can see Ishbel in the dark. You might just make out Ishbel in the dark dress on the left, and two of the younger children with her there in front of that slab hut. Quite a small hut for that many people, most of whom are, in our terms, adults, even if not legally at the time. They are quite successful. They are very hard workers. They open a sugarcane farm, which is really interesting work for Scottish immigrants to be doing. And they seem not to have employees or slaves or servants or anything of that kind. So they work this sugarcane pitch by themselves. They build a mill by themselves. They're quite interesting characters. So this is a photo of the family much later, and you can see that they've built a nice new house. So Donald Sr. is sitting down second from the right. So that's the father. And they're actually all then marked. We have Don at the far left, Marty or Mary standing next to him, Kate sitting down, Duncan next to her, and then Alex or Alistair on the far right. And one of the interesting things is once they've adopted these English names, they adopt all of the variants too. So Alex is variously Alexander, Alex or Sandy, but in private he's usually still Alistair. Obviously, the rest of the family are not present. Erchen sadly had an accident at the age of 13, so he was no longer part of the family unit. And, of course, where the story always ends up is with the gravestones. And I make a point of visiting them in person because there's always interesting information to be gleaned. So this stone marks Donal, the father, Ishbel, the mother, Eirchan, the young lad, Lachlan, the oldest son, and his wife, Rhoda. So 5 of them on this one headstone. Ishbel dies in 1880. Donal makes it through another 4 years, and it's quite sad. He writes some beautiful poetry in Gaelic about how much he misses her. Now, Donal, bear in mind, is a school teacher, a schoolmaster. His life revolves around reading and writing, and he seems to have the music in him. He writes an endless quantity of poems and songs, and he also writes an account of the island of Col, from which he came originally. And that account is the original manuscript, unfortunately, is lost. There's still some faint hope that we might retrieve it from somewhere. While I think of it, Naomi, please wave at me when I've got to shut up. Yep, good. Yes, Donal is a very prolific writer. The text of his account of the Isle of Col is preserved back on Col, which is lovely. But he writes, as I said, some beautiful, beautiful poetry when Ishbel dies, talking about how his life is now meaningless and he wishes he could wrap her in his plaid and all sorts of beautiful sentiments. But this one I think is very topical. He says, there won't be a sermon tomorrow, even though it's the Sabbath. The Coracai Church of the Gaels, that is the Presbyterian Church, it will be sad because there'll be idiocy and folly, girls as usual, because it's the Queen's birthday. So he's very down on the whole idea of celebrating on the Sabbath. So very, very proper Western Isles Presbyterian sentiments there. So that's Donal Senior, as I say, a prolific writer in Gaelic, and yet he doesn't seem to speak Gaelic in the community, only at home. Just pours his heart out in writing. Lachlan, the eldest son, also on that same grave marker. We have this wonderful account preserved, not in Lachlan's own words, but a distant relative, Susan Alley, has paraphrased his diaries into this book called The Battle of the Bar. Lachlan was a steamboat captain, and this account is of him going to Sydney for work. And it explains how he went to the Temperance Hall in Pitt Street, where a Gaelic meeting was being held, and I'm fairly sure this is the Highland Society of New South Wales. It was an enjoyable evening for Lachlan, as he so rarely heard his native tongue spoken. And he starts chatting with a person from Skye, and they reminisce about home and in Gaelic. It's all very pleasant. As far as I've been able to ascertain, we have no written record of Lachlan's own words, which is a great shame. Now, Donald Jr., Donal, born on Eck. This is his grave marker. They're all in the Coracai Cemetery. It's really interesting. I went to Coracai Historical Society and said, where are all the McKinnons buried? And they said, we don't know. They're not in our cemetery. So I went to the cemetery. All right, so Donald Jr., also a poet, perhaps in a lighter vein. None of us here is old enough to remember this, but some of us might be old enough to remember accounts of this. Queen, when is it, 1893, some royal jubilee or other, some kind of festive moment like the Queen's birthday, and it was all the rage to be singing this Tarara Boomdier thing. I don't know what the occasion was, I must look it up, but Donald writes this wonderful, quite lengthy song, and I've just given you a verse here, the man who has a parrot, and he teaches it in Gaelic, but without a word at it now, except Tarara Boomdier. And you won't hear anything but Tarara Boomdier being sung everywhere you go, and it really makes me mad, Tarara Boomdier. So that's Donald Jr. Not quite the serious poet his father was, but definitely with a way with words in Gaelic. Then we have John Ian, who becomes the de facto head of the family when father dies in 1884. and John is also in Coraki Cemetery. And we're lucky enough to have a photo of John. It's not a particularly good one, but we have it. And John is a really prolific diarist. He keeps diaries throughout his entire adult life. A lot of them are lost, but a lot of them we still have. I found some in the archive of the University of New England that hadn't hitherto been noticed. And this is his handwriting, and this entry, I think Naomi might have already seen this one. This particular day, I think just gives a really clear snapshot of what life was like. So he's written very neatly, fine, slight frost, keeping rather cold for August, blah, 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 this is what we did today. And that's his account for the day. Clearly puts his diary away, and then the neighbour comes over and he's written up the side, Robert Fogwell shot himself at 6 p.m. through the head. This is what happens in these remote communities. We think Robert Fogwell was in some kind of trouble, and it wasn't an accident. A couple of days later, he writes how he goes over to the Fogwells' farm and helps to put the body in the coffin, and says that it smelt badly. I'm not surprised. It was very, Coraki is sort of subtropical in climate, obviously, because they grow sugarcane. So that's John's own handwriting, and I think it's what he owns. It's quite nice to be able to see that. John gives us a few hints about what happens within the family circles. He talks a lot, his entries are mostly very factual about the weather and the work that they got done that day. But when people come to visit, he always makes a point of noting that. So in 1882, 2 years before the father dies, had a dance last night till 12 p.m. at the till 12 p.m. The McLeans, Fogwells and Flynns were with us. Enjoyed it very much. Mrs. McLean is here tonight. Paid me £1 due. He's also very good at keeping track of money. Father would not let her go until he had worship in Gaelic. And it's a Presbyterian thing to have worship every night before bed. And so for Father, it's a rare treat to be able to have other people who are willing to share that experience in Gaelic. So that's a lovely little hint about how important these networks of visiting Gaelic speakers are for the kind of, mental well-being of the family. Now, very interestingly, after Father dies in 1884, John starts making some of his diary entries in Gaelic. He doesn't seem to, I haven't found any of his entries, bear in mind we don't have all the diaries, but I haven't found a single entry prior to his father's death in Gaelic. It's almost like he's lost a link to his past, and he's doing this to kind of try to keep a hold of something. And again, it's very factual, heavy skies all day. There was a little shower in the morning. I love this. Fencing with Alistair, 32 panels today. Donald was in Coraki all day. Kate's having trouble with her cattle. Just day-to-day stuff, but all in Gaelic. And it's very good Gaelic. There are some interesting spelling peculiarities. He is clearly more used to speaking and hearing Gaelic than he is to writing it. But his spelling peculiarities are not what we would expect from a Gaelic learner today, or a Gaelic speaker even, where we might spell things with a more English way. These are things that are spelt in a more Gaelic way than the Gaelic, if that's possible. So, for instance, the word leivig at the far end of the second last line, leivig, it's spelt with a GH, but it's pronounced as though it was spelt with a BH. So, he's actually done quite a good job. So this is John continuing now. The diaries that we have surviving become less and less from 1885 onwards. I haven't been through all the pages of all of the diaries from then onwards, but this habit of writing in Gaelic seems to be something that's really kicked in when the father dies. We don't have the diaries for the year of the death, unfortunately. Now, the next group of people I want to look at the next person I want to look at is the chap from the Slate Islands, Charloch McCungish, the Slate Courier. Now, I've been able to find absolutely nothing about what happens to Charles in Australia, but what we do know is that he ended up in Geelong, New South Wales. For those familiar with New South Wales, it's near Yass, which is near Canberra. In Geelong, there is a very large, what is now a monastery, which was originally the land holding of an Irishman called Kelly. And was it Kelly? Thank you. Ryan. I knew it was one of those Irish names. I really should write these things down. Yes, so Ned Ryan's landholding, which becomes a Redemptorist monastery and is still in the hands of the Redemptorists. It has a graveyard on the property, which is full of very elaborate, very fancy Irish gravestones. Not a word of Irish language on them, but lots of symbolism, various kinds. But also in that graveyard on the property is Charles McInnes, or Charlotte McInnes's gravestone. And it's a little bit sad. It says he's a native of Casdale, which doesn't exist, but one can see how a C and an E might be confused. And it says that he died on the 3rd of November 1903, aged 72. It's definitely our man. But what's really interesting about it is that below the Bible verse that you can't read, that's not particularly interesting because it's just a Bible verse, there is an inscription in Gaelic script. Chachil, chachil, chachil mi tuilig, chachil gabrach gulana krinya. I won't return, I won't return, I won't return anymore. I won't return ever until the day of judgment. I have been unable to find an origin for that little line. It might be original, it's got the look of something formulaic, but I haven't been able to find it. What's interesting is that Charlotte, obviously, kept his Gaelic. And what's even more interesting is that someone else did too, because someone had to organise to put that on his gravestone. We know nothing about him. There's a suggestion, there's a death record of an infant who might have been his, but we can't actually find records of his marriage. So we're a little bit at sea. This is yet another thing. There's more work for me to do on. And I should have said at the outset, this is fairly early stages in this project. But Charles, I think, is a really remarkable, outstanding example. We very rarely find Gaelic on a gravestone in Australia. We don't find it awfully often on a gravestone in Scotland, to be honest. So this piece of the puzzle, I think, is a really interesting one. There's obviously more to be unearthed at Geelong. Unfortunately, the Ryan and Redemptorist connection is so strong that nobody seems to have noticed there were other people there, but we'll work on that. Now, nextly, I wanted to think about Caristine Niclodge, who came to Australia as a 6-year-old. Here she is with Archibald Cameron, her minister husband. And we do have a few hints, again, about what went on in her life. I think it's pretty clear from this picture that Archibald was quite a bit older than her, as was so often the way. She was still a teenager when they married, and her great-granddaughter, Eve Chappell, and her grandson, Archie Cameron, who is Eve's father, was Eve's father. Eve still lives in Glen Innes, and Eve has seen Christina's diaries. They no longer exist. Eve may not be around for an awful lot longer. So, again, this is why this research is important. But Eve has written a book with her father, Archie, about the Scottish pioneers of the Glen Innes district, and these are a couple of quotes from Eve's book. After the marriage, they rode up to Wellingrove on horses from Sydney. Christina kept a diary and recalls in it where they spent the night. She records spending a night with the Camerons at Falconer Plains. They were not related to Archie. The forerunner of Guyra, which is a town about 60 kilometres south of Glen Innes. And the pleasure of conversing with them in Gaelic. So this is the level of reference we get to Gaelic, these little things about, oh yes, I'm caught up with such and such, so we were able to speak Gaelic. And then Eve records that in later years, it was said that she and a friend would sit talking in Gaelic, and whilst doing so, pointing at their children. Now, what parent can't identify with what's going on there? That kind of, oh, that one's a little brash, he won't put his toys away or whatever it is, but not wanting the children to understand. So it's very clear from these little references, and sadly, as I say, we don't have the original documents, but we do have a person who remembers. It's very clear that Christina was still speaking Gaelic, but also very clear from the fact that she uses it with her friends as a code that the children won't understand. She has no interest in passing it on. She's not bothered that her children and grandchildren can't speak it. And so we're seeing, this is what happens to Gaelic as far as I can tell. Here is Christina in her final resting place. Beloved wife of Archibald Cameron, born Isle of Skye. One of the really classic things that Scottish people in Australia do is they put their point of origin on the gravestone. So the other gravestones we've looked at, they've said where they come from. The Isle of Skye doesn't cut it. Skye people don't say they're from Skye. They say they're from Kilmuir or from Slate or from wherever they're from. So I feel that her Gaelic identity has been elided quite seriously here. Gravestone, I assume, erected by Archibald. The memory of the just is blessed, a nice, biblical reference, as we'd expect from a Presbyterian. So I think by the time she dies, Christina is to all intents and purposes no longer Gaelic. She's not outward looking with her Gaelic. She might still occasionally speak it if she finds a crony who also speaks it, but that's the extent of it. It's not even visible as an identity, much less a language. Okay. So next, I'm almost there. I want to look at a place that is quite close to Glen Innes, and this is a place called Inverell. The part that's marked on the map is actually Glen Innes, and if you follow that yellow road off to the left, you'll see that eventually it comes to Inverell. Now, we've put the whole district map up because it's really interesting to see the mixture of Indigenous and Scottish place names. So we have Glencoe, who hasn't heard of the Glencoe massacre. We have Oban, ferry port for most of the Inner Hebrides. We have just heaps of Gaelic names, but interspersed with Indigenous names. Those Gaelic names can all, as far as I know, be accounted for by reference to places people came from or ships' names that they came to Australia on. The exception is Inverell. Now, Inverell was founded by Alexander Campbell. He was born in 1792 in Argyll, Gaelic-speaking area. In 1825, he was appointed the overseer of Blair Moor, a very large cattle station near Aberdeen. Can we get any more Gaelic references into this sentence? The McIntyres owned Blair Moor, and they were from Perthshire, probably also Gaelic-speaking, although hard to know. In 1839, they send Alexander Campbell north looking for new country, looking for more land to put their cattle on. So Campbell claims and names a property at Inverell. He dies in 1856 and is buried on the property, not that that's particularly relevant. But here is Inverell. And there's two things about this map that are really important. The first is that just to the left and below of the word Inverell, you can see where one body of water flows into another body of water, creek into another creek into a river. So that's the first thing. And the Gaelic word for that thing is Inver, I-N-B-H-I-R, anglicised to I-N-V-E-R. The other thing I want to point out on this map before I turn the page is down on the bottom right, there's a nice little lake. This is that lake. And those things on it are black swans. The Gaelic word for swan is Éala. So we have Inver, Éala. So Alexander Cameron is creating a place name that does not exist anywhere else in the Gaelic-speaking world that describes the place he is naming in Gaelic. You can't get more clear evidence that Alexander Campbell was a conscious Gaelic speaker. He may not have been using it in his everyday life, he may not have been communicating with his employers in it, but it was in his head, and he chose to give that name to this place. All right, that's all my bits of evidence. So can I draw this together in some way? I'm not going to read that. You can read that when you get bored with what I'm saying. So I want to think about the prognosis. I want to think about what happens next. This is fairly early in this research project. I am trying to pull together a book about the use of Gaelic in New South Wales in the 19th century. There's quite a bit more work to be done, obviously, and once I've done that, I want to expand it and make it a bit more comparative. Meanwhile, the things that I think come out of what I've tried to present today are, firstly, we need a really, really sensitive, nuanced, dare I say, slow approach if we want to retrieve the evidence that there is concerning the linguistic and cultural identities of Gaelic Scots in the Pacific. That is very, very prominently so in Australia. It's going to be 100 times more the case in New Caledonia, for instance. Right, we're going to have to really, really dig. We're going to have to read diaries and hunt for that elusive word. We're going to have to look at gravestones. We're going to have to, interview people. That said, I think it's an enterprise that we can and should do. We need to follow up leads. We need to follow up tangential references. We need to interview descendants. We need to pore over maps. We need to jump into Trove and read all the newspapers. We've got to just keep looking. And we've got to rely on serendipity, and we've got to rely on wonderful students who tell you useful things that they think might interest you. It's interesting that the hints that we can find that way are likely to be overlooked, and in fact have been overlooked by people like Malcolm Prentice and all of the other people who've written about the Scots in Australia and New Zealand. They are likely to be overlooked if people don't have a sensitivity to the details of Gaelic culture, presenting psalms. If they don't have a knowledge of the language, no one would know Inverell meant confluence where there are swans if they didn't know Gaelic. So it requires a real focus of skills, it requires a real focus of backgrounds, and it requires a real urge, a real need to uncover this information. I've got those. And then I guess the other question is, why does it matter? Why should we do this? Why should we try to preserve the traces of a short-lived culture in the Pacific, miles from its point of origin? Well, first and most obviously for me, these are people's lives, and any life story is worth telling. Secondly, they're the remnants of a culture and a language that have been transplanted literally to the other side of the world. They are the traces of a culture that is changed by that transplant. They're the traces of a culture that has largely struggled and in many places died out back at home. And so they can enrich Gaelic culture. At home, the culture and language, as I say, have been radically diminished, but they have clung on tenaciously, and perhaps they can be strengthened by knowing and understanding how desperate people in desperate circumstances managed to maintain them. And thirdly, if we genuinely want to understand who we are as a settler culture in the post-colonial era, all the pieces of the puzzle have something to contribute. So it's not only the descendants of these Gaels, but all of us who are descended from immigrants to the Pacific who should consider this a part of our story. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, for this extraordinary talk. I really enjoyed it, and I was not the only one to enjoy it. I know that. So are there any questions?
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And I had a question. In your first slides, you mentioned that most of the immigrants were illiterate. Do you think this affected their ability to maintain or evolve the Gaelic language after emigrating from their motherland, if I can say?
It's quite an interesting point. Interesting, I didn't say they were illiterate, which doesn't mean they weren't. Malcolm Prentice said they were illiterate. And certainly a lot of them would have been. To this day, most of the Celtic languages, we find there are more people who speak them than people who can read them. That said, it's got to be a problem, hasn't it? If you can't write it down, you've lost one of the ways in which you could transmit it. So if we think that maybe half, 2/3 of them, whatever, could write in Gaelic, then that's a third of the people's voices that we lose as soon as they can't speak. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important point to consider. But I think there's more to it than that. I think the fact that they stop using it in any way in public means that even the literate ones aren't doing what we would hope they might have done to help us be able to find it now. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I have another question. Is there a revival or a will to revive the Gaelic language? And if it's the case, what are the means used to do so, especially in the communities, Scottish communities in the Pacific, even though they are small?
Very good question. I'm one of them. I'm one of the ways. So I teach Gaelic. I have, as well as working at the University of Sydney, I have my own community school where I have quite large and healthy Gaelic classes. Some of my students are actually online. There are others of us. So I mentioned my teacher Angus at the beginning, and Angus was a fisherman, and he, having come to Australia, spent about 30 years inviting people into his home, teaching them Gaelic because he didn't want it to die. And I think that's really powerful. So we have quite a lot of schools. There is a Scottish Gaelic Society of Victoria, which actively teaches. I have students all over the country. I don't know that there's any Gaelic being taught in New Zealand at the moment, and I'm assuming there's not elsewhere in the Pacific, although, we could hope. We could maybe do it one day. And it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the really important and useful things is that with the internet, I know a guy in New South Wales who actually chats regularly with a Gaelic speaker in Germany. It's the ability to keep those networks going without actually having to be physically in the same place, which, paradoxically, after COVID, we've got much better at that, which is probably one of the very few good things about COVID. So I think on this side of the world, we're probably punching above our weight, to be honest. We're doing better than, in some ways, than the homelands. Gaelic is, I think, quite strong at home. I think its future is healthy. I think, I went to a conference. I keep telling this story and it's like I feel like it was yesterday, but it's now kind of 15 years ago. But I went to a conference in Glasgow and my arrangements with my friends fell through, so I ended up sitting at conference dinner on a table full of young men. It's a terrible thing, all in kilts, all beautiful young men. And they spent the entire night speaking in Gaelic. And I said to them, you must be from the islands, you've grown up with Gaelic. And they said, no, we just started learning it at uni. And that, to me, that's just gold. That means people want to speak it. People are working with it. I might personally not 100% approve of the kind of Gaelic they speak. It's what we call city Gaelic. It's not island Gaelic, but it's Gaelic, and that's what really matters. And the other piece of the puzzle that I didn't talk about today, except for very, very tangentially, is Nova Scotia, where there are still native speakers of Gaelic. And that's really powerful too. So, I think the prognosis is good. I think obviously we can always do more, but I think that the willingness to perpetuate the language and preserve it and see it right is strong. There's one. So there's a question in the chat box. I might just do that while you. Thank you. Mentioned that the Gaelic language is a treasured but private part of the identity of Gaelic Scots. Elaborate on how the preservation of the Gaelic language manifested in community practices. Well, I think that's the thing. There were no community practices. It was very much a personal use of Gaelic. So, you in the room can't see that. So the question is about how the preservation of the Gaelic language manifested in community practices and whether those practices evolved or remained intact. And I think that's part of the problem. Apart from the Highland Society of New South Wales and its ilk, the Caledonian societies in the regions to a very, very small extent. But otherwise, we really don't see community use of Gaelic. It's very, I'd almost use the word underground. You know, people are meeting up almost fortuitously with other Gaelic speakers and having a right old time of it and speaking Gaelic for a few hours, and then they go their separate ways. There's not a concerted effort to keep it alive, except for that church in Paterson that wanted their precentor. That is an exceptional community in the context of the Pacific world, as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Ma'am O'Neill. I'm so sorry because I don't speak English very well. And Madame Beck, est-ce que ça serait possible de traduire, s'il vous plaît? S'il vous plaît.
Come on, Naomi, don't be lazy.
Je suis désolée, on parle pas trop anglais, du coup on n'a pas trop compris en fait la conférence, en fait le thème. Mais j'ai de nombreuses questions à vous poser. Moi, ça serait tout d'abord, quelle est la différence entre le gaélique irlandais, le gaélique écossais, et en fait, c'est quoi la différence entre gaélique et le celtique? Est-ce qu'il y a des événements aussi culturels qui promeuvent justement la langue et la culture gaélique en Nouvelle-Zélande ou encore en Australie? Est-ce que je veux m'arrêter sur ces 3 questions. Après, ça serait possible de poser. Ok.
Sure, that's one of my favourite questions. So, the Celtic language group has 6 modern languages. We split them into 2 halves. One half we call the Gaelic languages, confusingly, and the other half we call the Brittonic languages, right? So that's Welsh and Cornish and Breton, and we have lovely Breton people here. And the other half we call the Gaelic languages. The language of Ireland we call Irish. It's not called Gaelic. That's usually used as a term of offence. The Gaelic of Scotland we call Gaelic. And then there is also the language of the Isle of Man, which is sometimes called Gaelic and sometimes called Manx. And so the 3 Gaelic languages, I often, people ask me, are they mutually intelligible? And I tend to answer, it depends how much you've had to drink. Because I've been so often where Irish people go, oh, I can't understand anything those Scottish people say. But, 6 hours later, after a few beers and the Jameson's bottle is open, suddenly they are understanding each other very well. I personally have had a conversation with a Manxman where I've been speaking Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and he's been speaking Manx, and we conversed perfectly fine. So they're mutually comprehensible, but quite different in many particulars. Yeah.
Merci, thank you.
Oh, yes, so Celtic, yeah. Oh, so Brittonic, the relationship amongst the 3 Brittonic languages would be very similar. So Cornish and Breton have a lot in common, and I think Welsh is a little bit further away, but again, those 3 languages partially intelligible to each other and quite closely related linguistically.
Ok, j'ai encore d'autres questions si jamais d'autres personnes veulent poser des questions. Je peux continuer? Ok, j'avais posé cette question. Est-ce qu'il y a des événements culturels en fait qui promeuvent cette culture gaélique?
Yes.
Oui, à part la Saint-Patrick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Un autre.
So St. Patrick's Day is a huge one and everybody likes to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day. St. Andrew's Day is the Scottish equivalent, and Scottish people tend to celebrate St. Andrew's Day quite vigorously. But reflecting the different natures of the two countries, if I could be frivolous. St Andrew's Day is more about church services and public lectures and much less about drinking, which is a horrible thing to say. And I know that people who've spoken about St Patrick's Day will correct me and say that there have been times when St Patrick's Day has been very much about church services and serious things. So St Patrick's Day tends to be a very public, very, far-reaching event, whereas St Andrew's Day is more internal to the Gaelic, the Scottish community. St Andrew's Day is pan-Scottish, so we also get Lowland elements in St Andrew's Day. The Gaelic, there are heaps of Gaelic celebrations back in Scotland, and I think often if people are looking for really deep cultural experiences in a Gaelic context, they will go to Scotland for them. That said, the Celtic Colours International Festival has just finished in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and it's an absolute blinder. They have language, they have music, it's wonderful. So maybe I should say Scotland and Canada. We have small-scale things in Australia, and there are some Scottish celebrations in New Zealand. And I should say, actually, while I was talking about Inverell, I should have mentioned Dunedin, which seems to have a similar phenomenon to Inverell. It was a name put together by someone who really knew their Gaelic. And Dunedin would be probably still, I think, the place to go for Scottish culture in New Zealand. Yeah.
Pardon, madame, j'ai une dernière question encore, s'il vous plaît. Alors, ça serait, est-ce que la survie du gaélique se fait par le sport ou est-ce que ça se fait aussi, est-ce qu'il y a des chorales? Parce que dans toutes les religions ou dans toutes les langues, on a des chorales pour...
Those are really interesting. Not drinking. No, not drinking. Presbyterians don't go in for that sort of thing. Yeah. So there is a peculiarly Gaelic sport called shinty, which is played in Scotland, and I believe they play it occasionally in Nova Scotia also. As far as I know, apart from my friend Chris, who's taught his kids how to play, that doesn't get played in Australia. Shinty, it's like hurling, if you know hurling from the Irish context. It's a tiny bit like hockey. I hate saying that, but it's the quickest way to explain it. That is the only genuinely Gaelic sport. There's also that very odd sport called curling, where you roll things across the ice and then you sweep it, which is not technically Gaelic, but it's kind of taken on a bit of that character. Shinty commentary is always in Gaelic, so they don't commentate it in English, generally speaking. So that is a good medium. That is an important medium. And in fact, the Royal National Mod, which is the Scottish, I guess, version of the Welsh Eisteddfod for Gaelic, has just finished in Oban, and they had a shinty competition as part of the mod. So there you go. So sport is there. Choirs are big too. Like the mod has a huge choral competition, and there are regional choirs in all of the Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland. But I think there's also, BBC Alapa is a Gaelic language TV station. So, there are various ways it's perpetuated.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Nadine.
So similarly to Malcolm Campbell's presentation this morning, do you believe that there is a Scottish identity that is maybe particular to the Pacific and that may be a bit different to the Scottish identity that would be in Scotland? Definitely. And I think the biggest difference is that in the Pacific we have a Scottish identity. Scotland's working on independence and all that stuff, and so there is a drive to make a Scottish identity, but I don't think there truly is a cultural identity that is Scottish. There is a Lowland Scottish cultural identity. There is an Orkney cultural identity. There is a Gaelic cultural identity. I don't think there's a Scottish one, and I think that's a really important difference. Here in Australia, we throw it all in a big bucket and mix it up, and because there's not enough to go around, we just put
pull it all together as much as we can. And sometimes I think that's to the detriment of Gaelic, because those non-Gaelic elements kind of tend to be a bit stronger and a bit more easily comprehended, because you don't have to learn a language to get on board with them. I think Nadine.
Hi, Pamela. I would like to know, is there one kind of Gaelic Scottish language, standardized, or several, in Scotland, I mean, or several type of dialects in Scotland? Like in Brittany, or you got several types of Breton language?
Definitely.
And what is the kind of Gaelic Scottish talked in Australia?
Yeah. Maybe I should just hand the microphone over to my students if they're still with me. It's one of the most awkward things about trying to be a Gaelic speaker on the other side of the world. If you're, my Gaelic teacher was from Point on the Isle of Lewis, and he had a good friend who was from Ness on the Isle of Lewis, and I think they're probably about less than 50 kilometres apart, and they were constantly criticising each other for the way they spoke Gaelic. So there are a lot of different, like every village basically has a slight variant. More broadly, we can talk about things like Lewis Gaelic and Skye Gaelic. They're the two main kind of threads now. Because Gaelic wasn't codified, we didn't have a written standard for Gaelic until 2004, and I understand Breton still doesn't have a written standard for the whole region.
It's not there are several.
Yes,
Each village there is one kind of Breton.
Yes,
but
exactly.
At the time, at the 20th century, there is a trying to standardize, and that's a problem for the people of ancient generations.
Yeah, that's a tension we have in Gaelic too.
Yes, to hear the new Breton language.
That tension between and I mentioned, I said City Gaelic before, and that's kind of, for me, that's a bit of an issue. But the good thing about City Gaelic is that everyone can speak it and understand it. The kids can all learn it, the teenagers, the school kids, the uni students, they can all speak it. They all know exactly where they stand with it. It's lost the beautiful richness that the regional variations give us, One of my favourite things, the online Gaelic dictionary is a beautiful, beautiful thing. You can click through, not only can you click through and get the pronunciation of the words, but you can click through and see a map where that word is used for that thing. So, in almost all of Scotland, the word for water is uisge, but on Lewis it's burn, So that kind of information and that kind of richness, I think, are part of the culture, not necessarily part of the language in linguistic terms. The language can survive without that stuff. But I think they're kind of part of the identity and the culture, and I think they're really important. And it is a tension that's always going to be there. One of the there was a big flurry of publicity, might have been about 10 years ago. Bloke from the University of Liverpool, I think it was quoted as having published a study that said Gaelic will be dead in 10 years if we don't do something about it. What he actually said was community transmitted Gaelic will be dead in 10 years if we don't do something about it. And he was talking about that very thing. Grandfathers on the croft are not teaching their grandchildren the Gaelic they speak. The grandchildren are learning City Gaelic. It's the way it is, I think personally I teach my students a hodgepodge, but I try to teach them mostly Lewis Gaelic. I don't hold with City Gaelic. It feels wrong. But it's a huge problem. It's a huge, it's a huge concern for the language, as I'm sure, from my understanding, that Breton faces a similar problem, that there are so few speakers of some of the dialects that what can you do? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.